Walt Rakowicz here. As many of you know, I recently published a book on leadership called Transfluence, where I talk about the opportunity that we all have to make a difference in the lives of those that we serve. Today is another one of my LinkedIn live shows on leadership, and I'm doing this one with a former colleague, a friend, and a great leadership role model, Joel Peterson. And I'll tell you a little bit about Joel in a minute, but Joel believes that successful leadership starts with building trust. I think he's right. And I really want to explore that a little bit more today. By way of background, Joel was the co-managing partner at Trammell Crowe. He held a bunch of positions at Trammell Crowe, and I was there at the same time he was there. So we knew each other way back in the 80s. He's the founder and CEO today of Peterson Ventures. He's an adjunct professor of management at Stanford Business School. He's the chairman of the board of overseers at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And he was the chairman of the board of JetBlue Airways. He served on over 36 boards, other boards, and currently serves on the board of the Franklin Covey company. So I mentioned earlier, Joel, his focus is on the importance of building trust in business, in our personal lives. And he's written 2 books. Entrepreneurial Leadership is one, and the other is The 10 Laws of Trust, which I've become a really, really big fan of because it sings this very same things, many of the same things that I've written about as well. So Joel, welcome to LinkedIn Live. Great to have you on.
Great to be with you, Walt. Great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's awesome to have you on. You know, I tell you, if someone would have told us 30 years ago in the 80s that you and I would be doing a LinkedIn Live program, I would have wondered how much that person had to drink, first of all.
And none of us would have known what LinkedIn Live meant.
Right.
Online.
Exactly. We've come a long, but we are here. We've come a long way, right?
Yeah.
Joel, I've admired over all these years, I've admired all the things you've done. You know, frankly, the students that you've made a difference in their lives, business people that you've touched. And so, but today I'm going to focus on this whole issue of building trust. I mean, when you wrote that book, it really spoke into my heart. And because I just think it's so important building trust in terms of being a successful leader. And so I'm going to focus on that, and I'm going to ask you some questions regarding that. And I really like to start off by asking you, how you began writing about it, and how you began speaking about it, and sort of how it grew in prominence in terms of its importance in your mind.
Well, I think I really started thinking about it the most. So do you have feedback? I'm getting some feedback, Walt. Are you getting any?
I don't have any feedback at all on my end.
Well, maybe Dylan can help us sort that out. In any event, if I stumble a little bit, it's because I'm hearing myself in kind of an echo. But it all started with being betrayed, and I really think that while trust is this really powerful thing, this awful potential of being betrayed is part of it. And I think if you ever feel betrayed, you learn to respect trust, to value it, to want it in your life, and to never, violate it yourself. And so I started thinking about, what does make for high trust relationships? And then I started thinking about, can you actually build a high trust company? Can you create a culture that is a high trust culture? And how would it work if you did? And how would you measure it? And so that became a really interesting topic, almost academically, but at the same time, I was buying a bunch of companies and serving on a bunch of boards. And so I kind of had a laboratory to experiment with. And so I've really worked hard at building high trust relationships, high trust cultures, high trust companies, and I've learned more and more about it.
And it works.
It really does work. In fact, it's a pretty unhappy way to go through life if you're wary about everything, if you mistrust everyone, if you double rivet every agreement, and you can't trust anybody to do anything that isn't documented, you're going to have a a small and narrow and unhappy life.
We've all had enough legal agreements in our lives that have gone the wrong way. So I totally understand where you're coming from. And just so you know, Joel, I do not hear any feedback on my end. So I'm sorry that you're hearing it on your end, but you sound great here.
Perfect.
So, early on in the book, Joel, you talk about this notion of vulnerability. And I talk about vulnerability also. You say that it's a psychological hallmark of trust. And I think leaders have a tough time being vulnerable. I mean, I think it's look, you're at the top, right? And you've made it to the top. And now all of a sudden, but people look for that, right? I mean, they actually look for the human side of you, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I think many leaders think they're supposed to know all the answers and never make a mistake or anything. But if you'll think about the people that you really trust, they're not people who aren't transparent, who don't say, gosh, I'm struggling with this, or I made a mistake, we need to change it. You actually end up trusting those people a lot more than the ones who are not vulnerable. So I think it's kind of this recognition of humility that really we don't know everything. And the high trust leader is one who can be influenced, and that actually builds trust.
Do you think, Joel, that that a leader like that has less power in the organization because people see them as vulnerable?
No, I think they actually have more power. I think at certain moments, when people are really forcing things through, they may feel like they have less power. But I think in most circumstances, if they distribute power, they're vulnerable, and other people, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this notion of integrity, but if you've become predictable, you've actually distributed power in a way that the organization has much more power. You're much more capable of execution than if you withhold it, are not transparent, never expose yourself as being vulnerable, don't show any humility. It may feel powerful in certain brief instances, but it doesn't last. It's not durable.
So the key is not to hoard, but it's to distribute.
Distribute, exactly.
Yeah, I love that. And you talk a lot about that in your book. So let's talk about this word integrity. It's your first law out of the 10. So obviously there's some prominence there. And we've all seen leaders who, quite frankly, think they have a high degree of integrity, but when the employee surveys go around, they find that they don't, if they're looking at them, or that other people think differently. And one of the things you say, I think, is really interesting. You say that you need to establish it as a habit. And some people think you either have it or you don't, but I think you're saying that you can build it over time. But how do you become a leader who's self-aware of your integrity?
So I'm going to actually add a kind of a twist to what most people think about integrity. Most people think integrity means honesty, means I'm true to a certain set of principles. And most people think they therefore have integrity around the principles to which they've applied their lives. I encourage people to think about this idea of kind of structural integrity. In other words, there's no gap between what you say and what you do. You become ultimately predictable. And the power of being predictable is that other people can then make decisions for you. They can say, well, if Walt were here, this is what he would do. And therefore they're empowered. There's a bond of trust that goes with this predictability. And that predictability comes from this structural integrity where there's no gap between what you say and what you do. There's no difference in how you behave in your professional life and in your personal life. I know some people think they can compartmentalize these things and live one way in one compartment, another way in another, but people are smart. They figure it out. You then are not predictable. You then have a hard time distributing power. So that's really the notion. I would say the final thing is the idea of building a high trust culture, high trust enterprise is virtually impossible without a high integrity leader. A lot of it flows from the leader. And I know that you've seen this too, but I've found in all these companies we've backed, if the leader is a smoker, lots of other people smoke. If he's a If he or she is a triathlete, you get a bunch of triathletes. So people tend to mimic the leader. It's a very powerful thing. And integrity, I think, is the core element that a leader can use to develop a high trust organization.
That's interesting. So no gap.
Nope.
And actually, you want predictability in everything you do.
Yep.
I think it's great. So you, another thing in the book, you talk about the importance of empowering others to build trust. And one of I thought it was really a great story because it actually reminded me of something that happened with me. But you talk about your daughter, and you said that your daughter came to you, that you had a certain age that after which you would be okay if they went out and dated. But before that, it was off limits. All right. So, and she came to you and she wanted to go on a date, and it was before the time that you thought necessary. It's, let's face it, family dynamics can be tough, and we all unfortunately have got to deal with them. So I'm kind of interested if you could sort of tell the audience what happened there, and really, because it's all about how you build trust in your family as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think it is this currency that is really powerful in any organization, any set of relationships. It is really the most powerful lubricant for building a great enterprise. So the most important enterprise to a lot of us is our family.
Yeah.
So you want to have a high trust kind of a set of relationships. I learned one thing fairly early on, which was not to be a policeman, but to be a cheerleader. I think when I first started being a parent, I thought the idea is you're a policeman. You keep your kids from doing bad stuff. You keep them from hurting themselves, et cetera. And your job is to police. I finally had learned that really it's to cheerlead. So that goes along with this notion of trusting. So my daughter came to me and said, that she wanted to go on this date to this dance. And so we talked a lot about it and everything. And I decided I'm actually going to teach her about trust. I said, Rebecca, I trust you. I know that you'll make the right decision here. We've talked about this. I've taught you the principles and the kind of the standards that we apply. And I know that you'll make the right decision. And she came back and she said, okay, I'm going to the dance. Oh, wait a minute. And so I had to decide at that moment in time, do I say, well, you made the wrong choice and therefore I don't trust you and therefore I'm inserting my own judgment there, or no, I really do trust you. I think you've learned these principles and I'm going to take the leap of faith. And I decided that was the better choice. And she's obviously turned into a wonderful woman, and she's in her late 40s now, I think. So we've got through all that, but I'm glad I made that choice.
It's interesting you talk about being a policeman versus a cheerleader, because unfortunately, when you're a policeman, it's me against them or me against you. And when you're a cheerleader, you put yourself on their side. And I know we can't do that with everything, but I think that was really an interesting way that you handled that.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Well, didn't you find, Walt, that business is really a team sport? I mean, I found in the end, it's not one person driving everything. It's really a team. And if you can have high trust relationships where you're not policing people, but you're actually removing obstacles, encouraging, giving feedback, coaching, you're building high trust relationships. You're a more powerful team than if you're a policeman.
No question about it. And it's not win-lose. It's got to be win-win.
Exactly.
Another law that you talk about, which I thought was really interesting, honestly, I would never have thought about it, was to create a common dream. I never think about that in terms of trust, but you encourage leaders to basically express unique ways of respecting each other, ways that, come up with ways that people can do meaningful things in organizations. You talk about creating these hero stories in your book, sort of tangible reminders as to why we work there and why we respect this place and why we trust it. And so I'm kind of curious as to how I would never have thought of that in terms of building trust, but how do you think about those things in terms of actually building a high trust culture?
Well, so think of the image of a mountain range with a bunch of peaks, any of one of which you could decide to climb. And I find that if you don't have a common dream, people will climb different peaks. We did a study at Franklin Covey, which I may refer to in the book, where we asked a bunch of C-suite executives what the 3 most important peaks or goals were for the enterprise. And out of 9 people, I think we got 25 3 most important things. They were all climbing different peaks. And so trust levels go down. I also have this image of being belayed. That a lot of what you're doing when you're climbing a peak is you're roped together. And if you're roped together and not climbing the same peak, you're actually holding another person's life in your hands when you're roped together. And so to me, having that common dream, saying, this is the peak we're climbing, I'm holding the ropes for you, you're holding them for me, that builds high trust. If you're all climbing different peaks, the trust levels go down, because a lot of times you run out of supplies, you run into obstacles you didn't know, you won't have what you need to get there, and people will get lost on the mountain, and it'll devolve into a low trust, high power kind of an organization rather than a high trust organization.
So in other words, the more confusing an organization is in terms of what peaks we're climbing, the less trust there is in an organization.
Absolutely.
So it's incumbent on management to create clear goals and that sense of respect. That's very interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Okay, another thing you talk about is communication. And obviously everybody knows, I think, why communication can build trust. But a couple things you mentioned. Well, actually, the chapter is keeping everyone informed. I like that. But then you talk about owning bad news, which, by the way, I had my own difficulty with at Prologis, and also the importance of body language. Now, that's not something that I think people think about much in terms of leadership, in terms of creating trust. But I thought it was really unique. So, just how do you think leaders can sharpen their communication skills overall to create sort of more endearing relationships in their organizations?
I think it starts first off with embracing truth, and just whatever the truth is. It was President John Adams who said, facts are stubborn things. And I think the idea, if you just say the truth is a really stubborn thing, I'm not going to try to spin things. I'm not going to try to hide it. We've all been around people, and politicians are probably the career that is the most known for spinning things. And it's one of the least trusted of any career. So I think this idea of at first getting comfortable that truth is powerful, and I'm going to embrace truth. And sometimes truth is ugly. Sometimes it's not a happy thing. But I think telling bad news as well as good news, and before, during, and after events, is really the powerful equation for communication. And while people don't always like it, it's not always feel good in the moment. You look back on it and you say, I trust that person. They don't spin things. And I think if you want to build a high trust culture, you're going to have this open, transparent discussion. If you want to develop that, there are ways to hone your communication skills. I remember you'll recognize this because we were both with a fellow by the name of Trammell, who is not particularly articulate, great speaker or whatever. And I had just taken a speaking class, a communications class, and I'd learned a whole bunch from it. And I saw Trammell give a talk, and he was kind of fumbling around and everything. And I went up to him after the talk and said, Trammell, I've just been through this great course. You might enjoy it. What do you think? And he said, they love it when I fumble around. So you can see him saying that, but
I can see him saying that. Yeah.
he figured out his communication lane, and it was very effective.
Yeah. And there's no question about it. And we all love Trammell. There are aspects of him we love a lot, but the other thing is this body language thing. I mean, you actually think that people could break down trust by using the wrong body language as well?
Absolutely. Well, your body language will betray you. And that's why I say start with the truth. Start with getting comfortable with the truth, because your body language will show what you're really feeling. It's very hard to cover it up. So I think actually learning to manipulate, you need to be aware of it, and you need to learn other people's body language. One of the hardest things for me right now is I'm teaching these courses at Stanford over online, and I can't read the body language of people. I have these little postage stamp size visages that I look at, and they're spread across two screens, and I'll tell a joke and they're all on mute and they don't laugh, and it's miserable. There are just so many elements of the communication process that are denied online. So I love being in the classroom. I love reading how people are feeling, how they're reacting to things. And to me, it's just a huge part of communication.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a lot of instructors that can't wait to get back to that too. Okay, so Joel, you mentioned Trammell Crow Company, and I got to bring this up. I mean, one of the most familiar stories to me in your book, really touched my heart. It talked about the frothy real estate market in 1986, of which you and I both were living. You said in the book that you had a grim premonition that, how long are the markets going to stay good? The company had over $10 billion in debt amongst all the partnerships. Frankly, and you had an owner that said, "I'll never sell. I don't like to sell." And you felt that the company should be selling assets, pruning assets, paying down debt, and the like, right? To be honest, I was in the same position in 2007 with my partner, who was the CEO at the time, and that didn't end well either. So you said in your book that you wish you would have run toward the fire and confronted Trammell, the owner, basically the largest partner, face to face, and that your mismanagement of that conflict to this day was your worst professional judgment. Can you talk a little bit about that situation?
Yeah, first let me just say that I had a father who in World War II was a bomb disposal officer on a carrier, and it was hit by 5 kamikazes in the Battle of Iwo Jima. And as he would tell this story, his punchline would be, "Run toward the fire." Where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's fire, there's danger. Be the person that runs toward the fire. So I had recognized this problem, and I actually said, boy, with the 86 tax law changing, with the overbuilding in office space and everything, it's a problem. And I mentioned it, but kind of I was young. I was a CFO when I was still in my 20s. And so here I was with this iconic figure. And so I was tentative. I kind of knew. So finally I wrote a memo, and I called the office buildings the idle oil rigs. And when I couldn't get a rise on that, I actually left and moved over. You may not remember this, Walt, but I moved over to our residential company, and I became the managing partner at Trammell Crow Residential. And I realized that Trammell had fired its managing partner 6 or 8 months before. And I flew over to Atlanta to meet with him, and I realized this guy totally gets it. So I hired him back to replace me. And and Trammell didn't push back, so
didn't push back on that.
Didn't push back. So here was Ron Terwilliger, who was wonderful, running. I came back and I said, I don't want to finance these office buildings anymore. So I was asked to come back in, and I said, I just can't do it. So Don Williams invited me to come in as a co-managing partner with him. And a few days later, he came back in to say, I'll stay the managing partner and you become the co-managing partner. And I didn't know the airline industry yet, but being a co-pilot is not the easiest place to direct the flight plan. Mm-hmm. So after 4 months in the right-hand seat, I actually left. I resigned and moved to the West Coast. And a little bit like you, Walt, I ended up getting called back in about a year later to become the managing partner for a few years to kind of manage the turnaround. But I could have done it so much better. I mean, knowing what I do know today, I could have done so much better job.
Yeah, but but the flip side of that, I understand maybe it was your worst professional judgment, but you were at a certain point in time in your career. You were young, and that would have been difficult. One of the things I struggle with is probably a lot of people out there that don't know how to deal with it when they have a boss that doesn't want the same thing you want, especially if they're senior to you. And I don't know if you have advice on this. I mean, you did what you did, and I did what I did in 2008. I basically ran from it. I left, only to be called back. But, how do you deal with that? I mean, is there one way of dealing with it, or is it just facts and circumstances?
So I've got a map I'll try to describe here to you. I learned this from Marvin Bauer, who was the founder of McKinsey, he ran McKinsey for a number of years. And he basically talked about this idea of alignment. And it's alignment between five categories of issues: values, objectives, strategy, tactics, and controls. And if you get all of those aligned, you have a company that almost runs itself. And so I have always looked at, if you and I are doing something together and our conflict is over, what are we measuring? What are we controlling? Those are really easy to resolve. We can talk those through. If it's over tactics, who does what by when, we can sort that out. If we're finding that we're conflicted over that, bump it up to strategy. What is it we're trying to do? And typically we'll resolve it there. If we can't still get resolved there, then I bump it up to objectives. If we don't have the same objective, we really need to talk that through. So as I apply that to America today, I think I can get Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents all to agree that we want peace, prosperity, opportunity for our kids. So then it's the strategy of how do you do it? What are you trying to do? What's first? And who's going to do what where we disagree? But if you can't agree on those objectives, then you pop it up to values. What are these core values that matter most? If you can't agree there, so if you have a boss with whom you can't agree on values, my recommendation is leave, get out sooner than later, because people do not compromise values. They'll compromise with increasing difficulty as you move up that hierarchy of alignment. But once you get to values, leave.
Yeah. Boy, I could not have said that any better. It's so true. And, Trammell had good values. I mean, I truly believe Trammell, Don, everybody had good values. But you had a little bit more of I would assume, a strategic issue as to, what we should do with respect to this situation. Do we sell assets? Do we, continue to build and the like? And which would have been much more difficult, I would guess.
Well, let me throw another idea in there for you just to think about, Walt. I think a lot of people think of values in terms of virtues, honesty, hard work, et cetera. I've actually found that business values, the really powerful business values, are three things. One is growth. It's very hard to build a great company if you don't care about growth. Companies either grow or they decline.
Yeah.
Second thing is profits. Profits are really important. It's hard to have a great culture and a great company if you're not profitable. And then finally, respect. So to me, those three values are the three most important ones. And I ended up discovering that I didn't have congruency with Don or Trammell when it came to the growth and the profit thing. I felt like we needed to gear back our growth, increase our profits, and we couldn't agree on that. And so had I really realized that, I think I would have left and not come back to do the turnaround, because I realized it's been frustrating. So in any event, these are complicated issues, but I think everybody faces them. We don't always agree with the people to whom we're reporting.
No, we don't. Unfortunately, we don't. So let me end on this. One of your 10 laws is to show humility. And I talk about humility in my book about it being one of the cornerstones to building trust. And we talked about it earlier with vulnerability, but you mentioned that high trust leaders see their role as a stewardship, and that requires humility. And you also say that it's about the mission. It's not about you. I love that. I absolutely love that. And I use the same 4 words, it's not about you, in my book. I just want the listeners to understand why you think humility is so important. And I know you touched on it in the beginning, but why is that so important to building trust in an organization, in your view?
Yeah, to me, there are these two elements. The first one we've talked about, in that vulnerability, openness, transparency. We just like and trust people more who exhibit those traits. The other one, though, is this idea of being teachable. I think being a learning human being, a learning organization, is really a powerful way. If you get an organization that is caught in its traditions, that can't move, can't adjust, can't respond to the market, it's not a learning organization. That usually means it's aristocratic, it's not very humble, it's become a bureaucracy, and those are dinosaurs. they won't thrive and survive going forward. So humility means that you adjust to the market. You respect your competitors. You want to learn what the competitive response will be and everything, and all those things.
That's awesome. That's absolutely awesome, and I couldn't agree with you more. So, Joel, any final thoughts that you've got?
Well, the only one on this topic that I would say is I actually think we're at a crisis of trust in our institutions, in our politics. I teach at a university, and I think it's a problem there. So I actually think that really thinking deeply about stuff and maintaining trust levels and nurturing them are really.
Yeah, and I so much agree with the same thing. I think we have a void of trust in the marketplace today, unfortunately. Yep. Well, Joel, I have to tell you, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for being on. Great to see you again. Really, really great to see you. And I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today and joining me with Joel. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about Joel's work, go pick up his 2 books, The 10 Laws of Trust and Entrepreneurial Leadership. You'll find more about me at waltrakowich.com and Transfluence. Keep an eye on future live streams. And until then, I hope you all find a way to have a positive influence on those around you. And I hope you all have a very, very happy holiday season. Thank you very much. And thank you, Joel.
See ya.